Ned, some philosophers, particularly philosophers of religion, but also analytic philosophers, would use consciousness as the evidence, primary evidence, exhibit A, to defeat the philosophy of materialism. Do you agree with that?
I think I agree with it in the following way. I think that if materialism is going to be defeated, it's going to come from consciousness. Consciousness is the one phenomenon in our lives that may not be understandable within a materialistic framework. I think myself that it will be, but if you're looking for the weak points of the philosophy of materialism, consciousness is certainly it. It's worthwhile actually distinguishing between two ways that the philosophy of materialism might be defeated.
First, define materialism. How would you, as a philosopher?
Okay, well, one version of it is the mind-body identity theory. It's that consciousness just is a state of the brain, the way water is H2O, the way lightning is electric discharges, the way heat is molecular kinetic energy. So consciousness is a state of the brain. Now that could be defeated in two ways. One is, if it turns out that consciousness is a state of the immaterial soul, that would be really a big defeat for materialism. But another way would be if consciousness turns out to be something functional, whose essence isn't any particular kind of matter, but whose essence is something computational, the way adding is a computational thing. Now nobody feels that the fact that adding does not have a material essence shows that materialism is wrong. But in the case of consciousness, I think it would require a different way of thinking. We'd have to give up certain ways of conceiving of consciousness if it turned out that a computer program could really capture all there is to consciousness. For example, we ordinarily think that there's some sense in the idea of an inverted spectrum hypothesis. Things we both call green look to you the way things we both call red look to me. But if the computational approach is right, if a conscious state, its essence is exhausted by its function, then we could not have a red state functioning in one person the way a green state functions in the other. That function would capture it all. So we'd have to give up much of what we think are ordinary ways of thinking about consciousness.
Okay, but that would not invalidate materialism because the computer, whatever substrate that this is working on is still well in the material world.
In the material world, but not essentially so.
Okay. How do you distinguish between that?
Because if something is the idea is that water is essentially in the material world because it's just H2O. But adding isn't essentially in the material world because there might be an immaterial computer that could add. All it takes is to function a certain way. Even if an immaterial state could function that way, then it would be adding.
So it's not essentially material because it could, in principle, be done in another way.
That's right. And further, another aspect of it is that it doesn't require the same material substrate. It could be many different material substrates all functioning in the same way.
But if they're all material, then it's still essentially material. But if you can postulate it in a non-material way, that does change its character.
Yes.
How would you rigorously define materialism or physicalism? Do these differ from each other? How do philosophers deal with that today? Because people talk about it in a very common phraseology, but how can we be more precise?
Well, there are problems in being more precise. First pointed out, yes, there are. The biggest problem is one first pointed out by a famous philosopher, Carl Hempel, but also in some work by Noam Chomsky. And that is, the natural way to define physical is to define it in terms of what physicists talk about. But that leaves one hostage to the physicists of the future. We know that the physicists now, we know that the physicists now are certainly wrong. Future physics will correct what physicists say now. So we don't want to say that something is physical just in case it's in the ontology of physicists now, that is, things they think are real. So we have to say, well, something is physical just in case it's in the ontology of current or future physics. But then who gets to say what counts as physics? If the theologians take over physics departments and call it physics, that doesn't mean that we're going to call everything that they talk about physical. So there is that problem in how to define physical. One way that people have of getting around that is to just do it in terms of non-mental. To say that the physical is something that does not require mentalistic conceptual apparatus to talk about.
Now, if you deal with consciousness, it sounds like we'd get into a kind of a circular...
No, as long as you make the distinction between the conceptual level and what the concepts are about. So the idea is that what's physical is what does not require mentalistic concepts to talk about.
Concepts.
That you can pick out those things adequately without using mentalistic concepts.
And defining it that way carefully, you can still ask the question about, is consciousness that kind of material? You haven't destroyed your definition by defining it that way?
Yes, because what you're saying is what consciousness fully is, something that can be picked out without using mentalistic terms.
Yes, yes. Now that's a terrific way to form the question. And many people would answer no.
Yes.
You can't do that.
Right, many people would.
And how would you conclude? I mean, you skew very heavily to you think yes.
Yes.
But are you like 51-49 or 99-1?
20 years ago, I thought it was 50-50 on the issue of whether materialism or dualism was true. But what's happened over the last 20 years has boosted my confidence to 90-10. We seem to be finding out more and more, it's looking more and more like consciousness is a biological phenomenon. Of course, things could go the other way, and that could defeat materialism. If we hit a wall, if we suddenly hit things that we just could not seem to get anywhere with. But I don't think it's going to work that way. I'm a materialist.